I want to begin the day with a confession. While it's true that Jennifer and Ross and I can happily, indeed vigorously, defend every selection in our lineup, it's also true that I get to indulge myself a little bit. And as a result, this next cluster of speakers will revolve around the theme of space. While it's true that the question of whether or not Canada will engage in the next great human adventure in an active way is a valid question, it's also true that, like our next speaker, Brian Feeney, I was struck dumb with wonder when Neil Armstrong placed his foot on the moon in July of 1969. And like Brian Feeney, I thought, I want to go. In fact, my infatuation was so great that a few years later, I actually built a spaceport, a kind of wannabe Tamara-like simulation of what a small spaceport might be like in the future, and had this attraction at the base of the CN Tower where we blasted you through the core of the tower en route to your trip to Jupiter. Brian is going to do it as a real thing. He's banded a little gang together into a project called the daVinci project, and they are collectively in the race for a $10 million prize, which will go to the first private group that successfully launches a space vehicle twice in a row within the space of 2 weeks. But I'll let Brian tell you that whole story. Where is he? Brian Feeney.
Am I live? Do the necessary water thing. Okay. Couldn't bring my rocket with me today. So, this worked last night. As Moses said, oh, my coin's falling out. As Moses said, we're going to launch a rocket. This is our big idea. And so what I want to do is I want to build a rocket, and I want to fly that rocket twice into space within a 2-week period. It's got to be fully reusable. It's got to, it has no government funding allowed, no government hardware allowed. We have to, as I said, fly it into space twice within a 2-week period. The success of that effort is going to spawn an entirely new commercial spaceflight industry, an entirely new paradigm shift in what it means to go into space. Now, that's a pretty good idea, but there's probably a little bit of skepticism in your minds right now. So let's just take a slightly different tact here. You guys are pretty switched on to the whole paradigm idea. So instead, let's just say that I'm going to fly an aircraft nonstop from New York to Paris, and I'm going to do that over a period of 33 hours. And when I land in Paris, I will not only have broken down the psychological barriers of transatlantic travel, but I will have established an entirely new commercial aircraft sector. And of course, I think you mostly know what I'm referring to. It's the famous Lindbergh flight of 1927. When Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic and landed in Paris, fewer than 1% of Americans would fly in anything, anywhere. And within 5 years of the Lindbergh flight, the Pan Am were flying people by the Clipper boatload to Europe, and a few short years after that throughout Asia Pacific. So clearly there's an opportunity, certainly to compare in terms of paradigm shifts. Let's take a moment actually to just sort of measure throughout history what this paradigm means and how big it might be. The first One of the first biggest ones that I can certainly recall, but I wasn't there at the time, was a couple thousand years ago. It was the paradigm of Jesus and the Bible. We had we had Roman-style government shortly thereafter, around that time. We had the genius of Mozart and Bach and Beethoven redefining our idea of what is music. We had Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Einstein completely redefining our idea of what it means to look at the universe and where we live. We had planes, trains, and automobiles. They redefined our method of travel, and of course we had oil, which redefined our entire energy concept and how to work this planet and evolve industry. We've had a few nasty paradigms in history. We've had the bomb. That completely redefined the real estate of a couple of cities pretty quickly. We had the paradigm of the occupation and development, eventually, of North America and South America. It was a completely disruptive paradigm for the indigenous people. And indeed, more people ended up dying as a result of that effort than the bomb ever killed. We've got the current usual suspects. We've got the internet, personal computers, not necessarily in that order, biotechnology, gene therapy, that are hot on the paradigm circuit. We've also got the emerging paradigm of changes in energy systems in the form of fuel cells and high energy density storage batteries that are going to change the way the automobile works over the next 20 years. And of course, we can't forget the biggest paradigm of all, which is the God paradigm. I don't know who invented it. It started a long time ago, and it's ongoing. It's actually never stopped. All right, so we've got some idea of what this paradigm is and where it fits throughout history. Let's just take a look at those early days of aviation and just see how valid our idea of developing this whole commercial space is and where it fits in with the whole Lindbergh commercial aviation effort. In those early days of aviation, 1903 on, when the Wright brothers first built their aircraft and flew it, and for the next 24 years leading up to 1927, aircraft were fully reusable from the get-go. Rockets, on the other hand, well, developed in the private sector initially, were really driven by governments. Governments pumped billions of dollars into their development, and they weren't reusable. Is there possibly a scapegoat we found here? That, the G word, is government responsible or not responsible for, in fact, this taking place or not taking place, as the case may be? Again, a quick look at our history. The private sector almost exclusively pumped millions of dollars over those first 24 years of aviation into the development, testing, building, and most importantly, definition of what an aircraft and a commercial system was going to be. They defined, most importantly, the payload, and the payload was the person. Freight and so forth was a byproduct. In the first almost half a century of rocketry, the government has pumped well over $500 billion into that entire industry. Development, testing, flying of rockets. But they have defined what the rocket industry is. Rocketry began really in the World War II area, and they defined the payload as hardware. They defined the payload as weapons, as bombs. When Mercury was first built as a rocket, it was actually based on, and putting John Glenn into space, it was based on the ICBM Atlas Centaur vehicle. And that ICBM, of course, was not reusable. It was entirely expendable. And when you got 10,000 of these things, you really don't know, and your objective is to blow someone's city off the map over in Russia or somewhere else, you really don't need that high a reliability in the vehicle. The definitions, again, right through the Apollo program up to the current space shuttle, have all flowed out of the basic precept that's always been there as defined by government. So is government to blame, actually? No, of course they're not. It's not government's responsibility to us to provide us with a commercial, low-cost access to space. And indeed, right now, at our point in history, commercial space really has not actually begun at all. You say, well, there's satellites. Well, spending $500 million to put a satellite into orbit is not exactly every person's idea of what is inexpensive and commercial. paying $20 million to ride to the space station is probably the most expensive transportation ride that will have ever been paid in history, the Tito flight a month or so ago. Where's private industry? Why haven't they done it already anyways? Almost 100% of the aerospace's corporate capability is tied up in the pursuit and fulfillment of very lucrative government contracts in the building of these rockets. Their customer is not you and I. We don't have the money, certainly the size that they're talking about. Their customer is the military, and it's NASA, and it still is expendable launch vehicles. The biggest element of the paradigm that's happening is defining what the payload is. It's been talked about, but it's defining the payload as people. It's the evil space tourism phrase. It's okay to have tourism on the Earth, but for some reason, you're not supposed to have tourism in space. We are going to go to space because it's there. We're going to go because it's fun. We're going to go because it's profitable. We're going to go for scientific research. But most importantly, and most of all, we're going to go because it's a natural extension of our Earth biosystem. Our present way of looking at the planet, we look at it over there. This is where I live. That's my entire ecosystem. It has been changing and will continue to change over the next 100 years. Our biosystem is going to include near-Earth space, and eventually it'll include moon-Earth space systems when we've got the means to go there more efficiently. It'll include the solar system, and eventually over the next millennia and more, it'll include the entire galaxy. It's not an unnatural place to go. Tourism, people, have always been one of the major engines of change and providing the economies of scale of lowering the cost of transportation. If you've got a 747 and you park it on the ramp once a month and then fill it with 500 people and fly to Asia, it's going to cost you $50,000 a ticket. You fly it every day, it costs you $500 a ticket. All right, so we've got some idea what the paradigm is and what some of the ingredients of that paradigm are going to be. How are we going to affect this? What's going to make it take place? Passion. We need passion. I have a passion for this whole idea, and the general public indeed has a passion and desire to go into space. Various surveys will say 30, 40, 50%, 80% in Japan, people actually want to go into space. Right now, there's no door open. You look at the NASAs of this world, well, I mean, you can go to Russia and they'll open the door for $20 million, but you look at the NASAs of this world and it's the elite few that get to go into space. Don't get me wrong, the Julie Payettes and others of this world have earned their seats. They've shown to be the extreme capable people to, in fact, to ride the shuttle. But it's not a very open door for us. So we need to excite the passions of the average individual. We need to combine their thoughts with our thoughts. We need to get them to touch on the nerve and the lust of what it is to have adventure and go into space. And the means of delivering that passion, I'll try to do this without breaking it. Okay, got it high enough there. Here we are. The means of delivering that passion, in part, is building a rocket and simply flying someone into space and making the public a part of that experience. We need to get you into that seat. We need you to feel the thunder of the thrust, the lust, the desire of going into space. And I'm not talking about sex, at least not yet in space. We need to do this and deliver this passion through the mass media. What a better place to turn to than the all-informed mass media to deliver our message of passion. Now, about a year ago, the daVinci project put out its first press release, and it read something like the following. The Canadian team is going to launch the first civilian into space on a privately built rocket, and that rocket is going to be floated to an altitude of 40,000 feet under an enormous balloon, and from there will be launched to a maximum altitude in space of 120 kilometers. The next day, one of Canada's largest print media had a byline that read something like, Canadian team will float its rocket under an enormous balloon to an altitude of 120 kilometers in space and then launch the rocket into space. And it was quite interesting because space actually begins at 80 kilometers. You can't actually get a balloon that high. Another one of Canada's major print media managed to dot the I's and somehow say that the Canadian team was floating its rocket to near vicinity of the moon, within the vicinity of the moon, and we're then going to launch it into orbit. That would be quite something. So maybe we need to rethink a little bit about how we communicate our message, what we need to say to the public to get that passion out there. The passion, how we get it out there. What we need is a new press release. Maybe we need to have something that's a little frothier and close to home and maybe a little more barbecue oriented. So to read something like this: the Canadian team is going to put mankind's first beer can rocket into space. The carbon fiber, fully monocoque, base metal core structural beer can will be piloted by Canada's first civilian astronaut, Brian Feeney. The headlines the next day may read something like the following: Ontario government licenses first brewers retail in orbit. The Inco is now diversified into the production of nickel alloy beer cans. Labatt's is brewing 90-proof rocket beer, and Molson's is still rewriting that silly Canadian theme song. So, all right, enough levity for the moment. As Moses was saying, I'm team leader of something called the daVinci project, the first Canadian team in the X Prize competition. We have a lot of fun what we're doing, but it's also a very serious effort. We've got the best and most capable people across Canada in the aerospace sector. We're a total Canadian team in terms of being based here, but we identified where we need to add strengths to our effort. So in fact, we've got an entire propulsion team down in California. We are the only team to have actually test flown our engines. We began ground fire testing in 1995. We've flown them twice, as recently as March 9th, out of the White Sands Missile Range. These engines developed some 10,000 pounds of thrust. And not only the engines, the all-important flight guidance system, so you don't turn sideways, has been tested as well. We have the best in fluid dynamics, flight dynamics, research, and CFD capability out of the Russian space program. We even have several commercialized technologies out of NASA. If it's been commercialized, you're allowed to do it. You're allowed to use it. We've also got something called DCIEM, Defense and Civil Institute of Environmental Medicine. DCIEM is actually a Canadian government agency. We have them involved under commercial terms, which means we're paying them. That's an allowable means. They train all the Canadian Air Force fighter pilots. They train Julie Payette, trained all the Canadian astronauts, and they've put together an astronaut training program for us, for myself, and it is a lot of fun. You get to go in a centrifuge, they whip you around, they take you up to 40,000 feet in a chamber with an oxygen mask on, and they say take it off, and you take it off, and you try to do X's and O's and find out that you don't last very long. One of the better things that they do, and this is quite a neat one if you want to be an astronaut, is they put you in something called a Coriolis effect training device. It looks like a small centrifuge. They whip you around in a circle, and they then tell you to turn your head sideways. Now, the world record for being turned around in this thing with your head sideways is only 180 seconds before you yak. And they only allow you to go in this training device if you agree to clean it up. Now, think about it. You're being whipped around about 30 miles an hour, and, whammo, you just, it's all around you, all over the place. They do this so that you can understand the onset of nausea and how you feel about it. Does it happen in 30 seconds or 180 seconds? Bottom line is, when you're going up in the rocket and you're under G-load, you just don't look out the window sideways. Just look straight ahead. And if you want to actually test yourself, the next time you're at Wally World, Disneyland, whatever, you're on a roller coaster, just turn your head sideways and just wait 5 seconds or 3 seconds I don't want anybody to kill themselves here. Don't do it too long, and you'll get an idea what I mean. That's a lot of fun. I got to share with you at least one. How long did it take you? I won't say. I want to share, digress, and have one brief story here that was fun. Yeah?
How are we doing for time?
Oh, am I like way over?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm indulging you because this is my favorite subject. But
Okay.
you wrap it up in under 5?
Yeah, actually, what I'll do is I'll say roll video now.
Great.
Lights out. That's about 3 minutes, and I'll wrap it up. You gotta want to do that. It's going to be fun. As you can see, one of the novelties, a few of the novelties in our approach is that we're lofting the rocket to a very high altitude under a balloon. It weighs about 6,800 pounds going from that altitude versus 60,000 pounds from the ground. It's simply dynamic pressure. We also fall to earth like a rock. Newton's going to bring us down, and we inflate what effectively is a badminton birdie. It's a shuttlecock. It's a balloon. It lowers the thermal signature, raises the drag, and allows us to statically fall without having to fly the vehicle down. And of course, the parafoil at the end, it's all GPS guided. It pops out 25,000 feet. We got a 25-kilometer cross range, and we can have a very controlled landing. Keep it simple. No landing gear to come out. It lands on the ground. It's got an airbag, flops over, and we do it all over again. I'll wrap up here. I know I've been long. Lindbergh in 1927, brash young individual, goes to St. Louis, and he asks for the backing from 8 people in St. Louis, and they do back him. In today's dollars, almost about $6 million. It was $15,000 back then. One of his major competitors was Admiral Byrd, and Admiral Byrd had spent well over $100,000, $30 million plus now. Lindbergh's flight was successful. He had broken down the barrier, the psychological barrier of flight, and opened it up for the average individual. Our definition of commercial space flight is not going to be defined in the corporate aerospace boardrooms of America or Europe. It's not going to be defined by the NASAs of this world or the policymakers of the government. It'll simply be defined by you and I, by those who've got the passion, the desire, the will, the tenacity to go out and do it. Paradigm is going to come and does come simply from an individual. Those that dare to dream and put the action behind those words are going to make it happen. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.
You've got to love this versatile furniture.
Yeah,
It can get us up to space as well.
absolutely.
Well,
Okay.
Brian's situation is actually quite serious because he's also having all the usual problems of any entrepreneur. The people who have the vision don't usually have the money, do they?
Not always. That's
And the
right.
people who have the money don't
You gotta convey the
frequently
vision, that's right.
have the vision. There's one other comment that I heard a wag say recently that might apply to your situation, which is even in space, you can hear the shareholders scream.